So hi everyone, good afternoon or good evening, depending or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Urvashi, and I'm one of the founding directors of Tandem Research. For those of you who don't know us, Tandem is an independent research collective based out of Goa, and we work at the interface of technology, society, and sustainability. Tandem was set up in 2016/2017, and our work seeks to ensure that India's technology transitions are inclusive and equitable. So welcome to this webinar titled Can Excel Sheets Have Ethics? Responsible AI in India. We're delighted to have so many of you join us. Especially it's so late in the year. I feel like in general, there's a lot of Zoom fatigue. So it's really great to have so many people join us and have so much interest in this conversation. Let me just give you a little bit of background to this webinar, and then I will turn over to Angelina and then to the panel. So at Tandem, we set up our AI and Society program in 2018, around the same time that Niti Aayog released its draft strategy for AI in India. And at that point, we felt that the Niti strategy identified key social sectors in which they expected AI would have a transformative impact, and we felt that it was important to bring in more voices into this conversation, to bring in more civil society perspectives, but also to enable a greater exchange of ideas across stakeholders, so across government and private sector, between private sector and civil society, because it was a new area of work. A lot of the concepts were contested, they still are. Often we're talking about reusing the same language, but we often mean different things. So what we set out to do with support from FES, and thank you to FES for their support on that, was we organized a series of policy labs. We organized 6 policy labs over a course of about 18 months, where we looked at all the key social sectors that Niti had identified in their paper. And in some sense, that back in 2018, when we organized these labs, we were often asked by many of our participants that, is there really any AI happening? Is this too futuristic a conversation? And it's quite remarkable how quickly that has changed, right? I think now we all are pretty well aware of how ubiquitous the use of AI is in many things, whether it's in social media or manufacturing, the whole ambit, right? And so what we wanted to do with these policy labs, and this is in 2018 when the conversation was still new, was bring together domain experts, right? So people who've been working, for an example, in the space of education for a really, really long time. So could they help us understand what the problems in the education sector are? And could they help us understand to what extent some of the AI solutions that were being proposed could help address these problems? So we did these series of policy labs, and the reports are available on our website, and I'll post them on the link here as well. What we also did following that was to try and understand what is actually happening on the ground. Is it all just hype? Are we just referring to examples that are coming out of the US and other industrialized economies? To what extent is AI being used on the ground? And what is the manifestation of it, right? What type of AI? How are companies defining their use of AI? And so what we also did with support from the Umedyar Network India was was to try and do a kind of landscape study on the use of AI in 9 key social sectors, to identify what the on-ground experience was. And part of that was to try and localize what we were hearing about these global narratives on AI, including around the governance of AI. And so what we're doing with this webinar today is presenting a culmination of our findings over the past 2 years. Obviously, in a format like this, we can't get into all of this in much detail, but I can see that the links have been posted in the chat. So please do have a look. It'll be great to get your feedback. And so what we'll present today is a snapshot of some of our learnings and findings, and then we'll turn to a panel discussion. So before I turn to the presentation by my colleague Angelina, who is also one of the co-authors of of all of these reports, in fact, that are on the link. Just a few housekeeping rules. Please do keep. I mean, I think these have now become kind of standard. We all know these pretty well now, but please do keep yourself on mute so that there's no interference. We are recording this event, and it will be available available on YouTube later. I think those are all the housekeeping rules from me. And of course, I would like to extend a thank you to both FES and the Umedyar Network India for supporting our AI program over the past 2 years. And a big thanks to the Tandem team for helping to organize this event, Angelina, Chandika in particular. So with that, I'd now like to turn to my colleague, Angelina, who leads our AI and Society program. And she's going to give us a brief presentation outlining some of our learnings and recommendations based on the fieldwork and the policy labs that we have conducted. And I encourage you to please use the chat function. That might be one of the only benefits of not being able to do this in person. Funnily enough, actually, this event was supposed to be on the 12th of March, and we canceled that event because of COVID. That was when we knew that COVID was real in our mind, because we had to cancel a fairly large event. So I'm really happy that we've been able to do it. And really the only upside of not being able to do it in person is that we can use the chat. So please do use the chat function to post your questions. Angelina, so over to you.
Hi. Thank you, Urvashi. Thank you everyone for taking out the time to join us this afternoon. Let me quickly put up my presentation. Suppose it's up, no? Yeah. So like Urvashi said, over the past 2 years at Tandem, we've been consistently studying some of the various AI applications in different sectors in India. And so today in this presentation, I want to provide a brief window into some of our work in that area. But before I get into that more specifically, I want to start by talking a little bit about the various narrative enframings and the discursive formations in which AI is embedded. So as we know, the development of AI as a technology goes back several decades, and there is currently no consensus definition of what really is AI. But much of the current enthusiasm around AI emerges from advances in a family of computational techniques known as machine learning, where data is used to train AI models to recognize patterns in different in the data set and then predict outcomes. And these algorithms also improve and learn over time, right? So while some of these techniques have been around for quite some time, I think the game changer for AI has really been the availability of a large amount of data as well as increase in compute power, right? And we should note here that it's not just about the availability of data. The issue now tends more increasingly towards the concentration of data, of a large amount of data in very few hands, right? The second aspect of AI that I want to touch upon is that it's also a very contentious subject, and it is highly debated today. And often, this debate can also become increasingly polarized. So on one hand, you have a narrative of techno-solutionism that's taken hold, right, where AI is seen as a silver bullet that can help India, that can help many countries sort of supersede or leapfrog across a lot of the persistent developmental challenges that they've been facing. And on the other hand, on the other extreme, there is a view of AI as a grave threat to not just civil liberties and jobs, but also to human futures. At Tandem, we tend to view AI as a socio-technical system. And what this means essentially is that we don't see AI merely as a technology with its own inherent logic. Rather, it is something that's anchored in certain social and cultural values, practices, and norms. Right? And with that in mind, Urvashi's covered a lot of this, so I'll go over this very quickly. And so in 2018, starting 2018, we convened a series of technology foresight convenings, bringing together domain experts on multiple topics. And the reason was to choose these domains was also to kind of mirror the key areas of AI intervention that was outlined by NITI in India's national strategy for AI. And at that time, we realized that there's very little empirical work on this. So with support from Umakant Network India, we examined 9 key sectors, and we took on a field-based inquiry where we spoke to a lot of developers, startups, government officials, academia, and civil society. and what we wanted to understand through this project was essentially what is the scope of AI in India, right? What are some of the challenges, what are the potential benefits, and where are the potential harms? And we took on a sectoral spread because we also wanted to understand which sectors require greater public scrutiny. So in what follows, I want to present some of our sectoral findings. I'm going to try and cover 4 sectors, starting with education, and then health, policing, and if time permits, agriculture. So AI, starting with education, the education sector in recent times has witnessed increased investments in the edtech space, and many edtech companies have also begun incorporating AI into their various products and services. And additionally, the government, through various documents and policy initiatives such as your National Education Policy and the CBSE Skilling Initiative, has also highlighted the central role that AI is expected to play in this domain. And in our work, we've identified 7 types, primarily 7 types of AI interventions in this space. Some you might already be familiar with, such as the prediction of school dropouts, which was a project that was piloted by the Andhra Pradesh government in 2017 with Microsoft. And in one academic year, the platform was able to identify close to 20,000 probable dropouts in Visakhapatnam district. Similarly, government schools in Delhi, Tamil Nadu, and other states are also utilizing facial recognition systems for school attendance. And more recently, the CBSE has also rolled out a facial recognition-based system for verification for students to be able to download their mark sheets online. So I think the privacy implications of this is already quite apparent. But aside from these state interventions, we also have certain interventions such as personalized and adaptive learning and the provision of education loans, which is being spearheaded by private sector companies over here. And in our research, we came across one company which uses as many as 15 million data points to assess what is the future earning potential of a particular candidate in order to then underwrite loans by that metric. So these interventions bring with them expected benefits and harms. In the space of education overall, the benefits, the expected benefits is that using AI will help improve access to education as well as the quality of education. So personalized and adaptive learning tools will help augment the poor student to teacher ratio in classrooms and therefore provide more personalized learning experience to students. Similarly, assigning chatbots to students to take care of basic queries and doubts would help reduce teacher burden. However, the use of some of these systems like facial recognition or combining data sets for predicting outcomes raises concerns around children's privacy. And oftentimes parents or guardians may not also be fully aware of why or how much data is being collected. And this, then coupled with the kind of disparities in infrastructure, uneven access can actually also widen and some of the existing inequities in this sector. Recently, this year in UK, they had piloted a system for algorithmic grading. And what transpired was that the system was heavily biased against students from public schools who are being graded lower than children from private schools who are being graded much higher. And this part of the reason was reliance on historical data sets for this, which also contain some of the, which also contain societal disparities written within them. So, that's a lesson in foresight for India as well. Now, moving on to healthcare. So in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, there has been obviously an increased attention and interest in deploying AI for health. Investments have been on the rise, and the government has also expressed keen interest in rolling out AI in public health initiatives, also using AI for the Ayushman Bharat scheme, which was announced. We've identified 6 types of AI interventions in this space, ranging from disease detection to using AI in remote health monitoring and medical R&D. So using AI for disease detection has been in use for some time in India, and a couple of famous or well-known examples in this space. So here basically you use AI to be able to detect early signs of diseases like breast cancer or diabetic retinopathy at an individual level. With COVID, one can, I think, expect also that disease forecasting at a population level is going to attain greater prevalence. And in this space, there's also several instances of partnerships between technology companies, hospitals, and government institutions. I think Google's partnership with Aravind Eye Care for one is an example of that. The use of AI in health is expected to translate into better quality of healthcare solutions. So early detection, as well as advances in drug discovery using AI in medical R&D can potentially save a lot of lives, but the potential harms in this space can also be grave. For instance, in the form of misdiagnosis, which could result in health complications. So internal documents of IBM Watson's oncology tool, for instance, showed that often it produced advice which was counterindicative or which was actually harmful. And outside of the tool itself, if one pays attention to context, then harms can also harms can also manifest in the way in which people access healthcare services in India. So we know that in India, healthcare access is also heavily gendered, and women do not have as much access to health. So in that sense, in that context, the use of health data sets which are based on historical records might actually show a lower incidence of disease in women, which may not actually be the case. I want to quickly move on to AI and policing. In policing, we've identified 4 types of AI interventions. So several states in India, such as Delhi, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, have begun deploying or have plans to deploy AI-based surveillance and monitoring tools. In UP, for example, the state has deployed a real-time video analytics platform in as many as 70 prisons, which takes in video feed from 700 cameras overall. And the platform basically provides a continuous streaming of prisoners and their activities and automatically alerts authorities in case of any breaches. AI-based monitoring systems have also been installed in many traffic junctions in Indian cities, Bangalore and Hyderabad being 2 examples of that. And these systems have been installed to automatically stop violations and generate challans. There are also instances of AI algorithms being used to generate information on crime hotspots, as well as detect suspicious or flag suspicious activity online by using NLP. Additionally, there are also a few examples of internal efficiency management, basically through the digitization of police records using OCR and computer vision, and front desk deployment of a robot to kind of interface with the public. So in terms of benefits, these interventions are expected to improve the overall efficiency of police work, also to reduce the workload on police personnel, create faster turnaround times on crime solving, and bring down crime rates in the country. But given that there are long-standing concerns around over-policing of minorities or marginalized communities, there is potential that the reckless deployment and over-reliance on algorithmic authority can actually not only repeat, but cement the disparate impacts in this space. The centralization of databases clubbed with real-time monitoring, be it on social media or public spaces, could also threaten privacy, but also lead to self-censorship and targeting. So to use an example from China, the pervasive use of AI-based surveillance systems and facial recognition to track Uyghur Muslims has led to what has been termed as the largest open-air digital prison. So again, examples from other geographies should also serve as a way to as a lesson in foresight for us. I want to quickly go over agriculture a little bit. So in agriculture, again, we've identified 3 types of AI interventions in this space. Precision farming is one of them, where you use farm level data in combination with scientific know-how and hyperlocal data sets such as weather data to provide instructions about farming practices. These applications can also provide information on crop health, prevalence of pests, and how to take care of them. Right? There are also instances of using agribots for menial tasks like de-weeding, and this can actually minimize the physical toll that it takes on a farmer. There are also companies that are using AI to optimize farm-to-market supply chains, provide market advisories, and reduce wastage in the supply reaching from the farm to the market. So computer vision is also being used to inspect the quality of produce quality. And there are also examples of financial solutions for farmers where AI and IoT devices are used to get a better sense of the crop yield, state of crop health in order to provide better insurance benchmarks or better credit terms. While I've covered some of the benefits, there's also potential for harm, and one of that is there is a scope for market monopolization in this space. So companies that are invested across the agricultural supply chain, for instance, can use their different touch points to actually forward recommendations that serve their interests. All right, but I think more importantly in this space, job loss or automation and disparate impact is also important to take note of. So according to figures from NCAER, 42% of India's agricultural labor force is actually women, but they own less than 2% of agricultural land. So agricultural automation in this case is likely to have a disparate impact, mostly on women who work as farm hands in the sector. So an analysis of these 4 sectors as well as the others that I listed before, we've arrived at a few key learnings and lessons from our workshops, our TFGs, conversations with domain experts as well have informed these learnings. But we've arrived at a few key learnings that I'd like to share. Right. So overall, what we see in this space is there are small and incremental benefits that are accruing from the deployment of AI. So pilot studies in agriculture again have shown that the use of precision farming can help increase yield and improve farmers' incomes. At the same time, advances in NLP can help widen access to multilingual information and benefit multilingual education in the country. But a lot of these benefits are yet to be scaled up. So, if the current use cases do not necessarily match the narratives of transformative impact that is often associated with AI. And part of the reason is also that we see a lot of challenges to adoption, which are quite similar across different sectors. So the lack of data, for instance, has developers concentrating on areas where data exists. Right. Similarly, poor access in digital infrastructure, as well as lack of grievance redressal mechanisms, are a few of the challenges to adoption that we see across all the different sectors that we studied. Now, in relation to that, monopolization of data and differential access to resources can also increase market inequities. So recently I read that, what will you do if Google enters your market segment is a favorite question that VCs like to ask startups. So we did come across in our research many companies who said that they are finding it hard to compete with larger companies that have more access to data, more talent, data storage capacities, as well as compute power. Also, we argue that, it's not, we argue that we need to kind of understand what the impact of these systems are. So because a single technology or one type of technology can be used for multiple purposes, for multiple ends, so it's really the impact of these systems on people, on their livelihoods, on markets, on the environment, as well as the democratic fabric of society that one needs to examine. Similarly, another learning is that the use of AI in public service systems and safety critical sectors should also be held to higher standards of transparency and accountability, because mistakes in this space or the cost of biased or inaccurate systems can be immense, leading to loss of life or wrongful prosecution. So similarly, when you use AI for the dispersal of entitlements, I think the same point applies. And because of the uneven distribution of technology gains can also entrench existing social inequities. The agriculture example that I just pointed out of women owning less than 2% of the land is one case. Similarly, the bulk of the AI adoption in India is currently concentrated in enterprise solutions. And even though adopting AI can increase enterprise productivity, that doesn't mean that it will necessarily percolate down at the level to gains for labor. So keeping these lessons in mind, we forward a few recommendations for the governance of AI in India. One is that policy interventions, like I said, should be based on an evaluation of social impact of these applications. Similarly, red lines and moratoriums have recently emerged as viable policy instruments, which can also be considered for certain damaging use cases. Investments in state and regulatory capacity is a must, as well as investments in analog components. So where we saw the benefits reaching people was where you had more investments from the state, or it was being, so in terms of diabetic retinopathy or screening of breast cancer was being rolled out in terms of free services, and the analog infrastructure for that was being built so that it reaches more people. In light of the data protection debate, again, we need to consider community rights and accountability frameworks. We need to take into account the affordances of AI as a technology in this context. And finally, this is something that we at Tandem are going to be working much more closely on in the future, is that alongside risk management approaches, we also need upstream management of technological innovation processes, right? So here we don't look at AI simply as a technology, but AI as a field. So if it's a field, then what are the incentives, actors and institutions that are needed to be able to develop this field responsibly is one of our focus. So, with that, I end my presentation. Thank you so much for your patience. I hope I've not gone too much over time. And I would have loved to present more sectors, but please do check out our work that is on our website. And, we are always happy to engage with feedback, suggestions, and comments. Thank you so much.
Super, thank you, Angelina. Like Angelina said, please do check out the rest of the report and the other policy lab documents as well on our website. We have a bunch of questions coming in. I'm going to try and take as many as possible, but I think some of them we can also raise again in the panel discussion. So I am taking note of it. So in case I don't get to yours, I apologize, but I will pick it up again in the panel discussion. Angelina, so one set of questions that is coming in is around the extent to which, we hear principles around fairness, accountability, explainability, etc., at very top level governance conversations, right? So in the field work that you were doing, where we were interviewing companies who were building AI solutions, to what extent were some of these principles part of their vocabulary, or part of how they were looking to operationalize AI?
I think in terms of just the companies that we spoke to, it varies quite a lot. There were use cases or companies that were developing applications where they were really cognizant of the implications of their technology. right? And you could see that in the way then that they design the technology. So it is, on the other hand, uh, when you interview someone or when you're just talking about the tech implications of AI, then you would hear terms like privacy come up or ethics come up, but they can also be hollow terms, or like buzzwords that are where there's an understanding that it's important to talk about it, but how do we operationalize it is not clear. So, and I think over time, I think in these past 2 years, more and more, there is now more cognizance of it than when we started fieldwork in 2018.
I think one of the things that I remember when I was speaking to Angelina and the rest of the team when they came back from fieldwork, one of the things that also struck me from their interview scripts was that a number of the startups were actually looking to regulation as a way to help operationalize some of these principles, right? So was saying things like, yes, we know privacy is important. We recognize how what we are building could have severe privacy violating implications, but we are looking to regulation to help us navigate this, right? And so that's hopefully something we can pick up again in the panel. Actually, another set of questions is on the and this is from Amba, on the kind of public-private partnerships we see around AI, right? So, what is the nature of those partnerships in social sectors like education and health? Are there companies like MSF, Google, Wadhwani, some of the traditional vendors, or are they typically more CSR pro bono arrangements, right? And is some of this information made available? And we also do have Rahul from Wadhwani AI on the panel. So again, we can pick this up during the panel as well. But Angelina, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there are public-private partnerships across almost all of the 9 sectors that we've studied, right? And within that, you have your big companies like Google, Google, Microsoft, who are a part of this domain where they're working with governments much more closely, right? The Andhra Pradesh government, for instance, used the Microsoft platform to predict school dropouts. Similarly, in Gujarat, they had rolled out the Kaizala app, which was then, because of protests, rescinded. But in the education space, there are also companies who are much more, who are very specifically providing some of these services, right? So like using chatbots to help students practice their language or for basic questioning is, some companies are focusing on those use cases much more, like zeroing in on that. And then they have partnerships with NGOs, Teach for India, for instance, where they roll out these applications in partner schools. So again, there is a mix here, but the wider scale, the ones that we see being deployed on a wider scale are with companies like Google and Microsoft.
Yeah, some of the more traditional big tech or larger players in this space, sometimes partnering with a fairly well-established kind of NGO, for an example, let's say for eye care. But I think and again, maybe this is a question for you, Umakant, during the panel, but the question I think is also what is that space between going from pilot to going to market, right? And I think we do see, I mean, I think even in the ICT space, India is often called a graveyard of a lot of ICT experiments. And, the question is whether the same thing is happening with AI. Do we have a lot of pilots which have these partnerships, but then how do you go from that pilot to taking something to market? Another question that's coming in, and this is from Srikara, is did you get a sense from the fieldwork that you were doing and perhaps, engagement with the domain experts that we spoke to what extent are these systems being developed with an ear to the ground, right? So I guess the question is, what are the kind of knowledge inputs and what are the kind of expert or inputs that are being given to develop these systems? Are they working with domain experts? Is it a very kind of top-down solutionism that we see?
I think, it's a good question. And I think I'm trying to, in my response, veer away a little bit from sweeping generalizations about this space, because once you've kind of studied all the different sectors and the different categories of AI intervention, it's really hard to generalize and say that no, there isn't, because where do you put that threshold, like where because developing AI is also an iterative process. So at the time when you speak to a particular startup, for instance, these things also kind of evolve over time. But again, we saw examples, we saw some good use cases or like good practices that were being adopted. For instance, when one application which is around mental health actually actually has a panel of mental health experts that also help them iterate and like improve their product, right? So there is at least kind of reference to expertise, as opposed to maybe really going on the ground and kind of checking what problem should. So in our fieldwork, we actually came across two approaches. One is that you have the tech, and then you look for a problem to solve with the tech, right? And the other approach is that you see a problem first, you understand the specificity of the problem, and then you kind of look for solutions, part of which may be AI, or maybe the answer lies in AI. So there are two ways to go about it, and we saw a mix of that again.
Another question for you from Nupur. So did you find out anything about the data quality or any sort of standards about the training data sets? Anything you want to reflect on that?
Yeah, in terms of like in health, for instance, one of the companies we spoke to were cognizant of the data sources, and so in terms of getting the X-ray records, and so they had partnerships with hospitals. There wasn't really that much talk of like standards about training data sets at that point, but they did sort of some of the more top level medical knowledge in terms of that physiology kind of differs for men and women, for instance, they were cognizant of it, right? So yeah, like there wasn't a strong conversation about standards at the time. And in terms of data quality, there is, again, the refrain is that we do not have access to good clean data sets. So that's definitely a problem that many companies are facing, and which is why it tends to be concentrated in areas where you see where you have data, or where it's possible to collect data.
Yeah, I mean, I think I should add here, right? Like, I think what we were also trying to do with this study was to get a sense of what the ground realities were, right? Before we get to the solutioning phase, right? And the rationale for that was that there's a lot of talk about AI policy, AI governance at a very kind of top level or even at a global level. But we wanted to understand that, how are people who are building these systems, who are sitting in startups or sitting in larger tech for social good kind of enterprises, how are they thinking about some of these issues, right? And to what extent are some of these kind of top level global conversations filtering down to the people who are developing many of these systems, right? And I think what we saw was that it was a very, very mixed bag, right? I mean, that's the easy way of saying it, of course. But that there were of course some players who had a very, very good sense, but I think there was a huge amount who were also really struggling, right? Who knew some of the issues that AI could pose, to some of the risks that we'd mentioned. It's not that they were unaware of them, or us pointing out those risks or prodding about those risks came as a total surprise, right? But there was yet a sense that, well, this is a trade-off, or there's competing priorities and we kind of have to march ahead, or there is a business interest here, right? And I think the challenge for us now is to, the challenge for as India thinks about its responsible AI framework is, how do you incorporate some of those on the ground experiences, right? Or those realities of AI development and AI use as we think about AI governance, right? So I think the question that one of you had asked, Shrikar had asked, perhaps, no, sorry, I'm getting the name wrong, about the operationalize of principles. I think that points to what I'm saying, right? That you have these high level principles, but you don't see many of these high level principles actually being discussed when you're talking to people who are building some of this tech, right? Maybe we'll take one more question because I think it's a really interesting question, and we'll turn to the panel. And that's a question from Shivangi. And Shivangi, if you don't mind, I'm going to expand your question a little bit. Shivangi's asked whether government employees, whether they specifically use the term AI. And I think maybe worth also expanding it that in more broadly in the fieldwork, when you were speaking to companies, what was the kind of language that was used? Was it the language of AI? Were we talking about machine learning? Was it automated systems? Do you have a sense of what was the dominant set of terms that were used?
Yeah, I think most refrained from calling it AI. AI as a term is also like, so to kind of also veer away from the hype. And if you speak to developers, they'll actually use more specific terms, right? So they'll say NLP, or depending on like the segment that they're working in. So they'll actually use much more narrower terms to describe. It also depends on your kind of degree of distance from the tech. And so when we spoke to police officers, for instance, they were comfortable calling it AI, right? So the term AI, so one of the insights of our fieldwork was that, AI is such a floating signifier. It's a term that can also be filled with a lot of meanings and like narrativizations of it. So practitioners actually also veer away from using the term. With government, I'm not so certain on like what the overall approach is. Honestly, I think Shivangi will be, has a better experience of that.
There's a lot of questions coming in, but I am really conscious of the time, so I am noting them, and we'll try and pose some of them during the panel. Angelina, so thanks very much. Thank you for sharing the presentation. And once again, please do have a look at the report, the various reports, and it'll be great to get everyone's feedback on it.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. A small apology if I went really fast. I just spotted a comment that asked me to slow down. So sorry about that.
It's okay.
But thank you for the.
Cover a field in 20 minutes, so that's okay. We'll send across the presentation it'll be on our website, and also this video will be this webinar will be recorded, so you can access it there. Great. So now I'd like to move on to the second part of our online event today, which is a panel discussion. And we have a really fantastic panel, and I'm so humbled actually that you could all join us. When I invited all of you, of course I knew that all of you were leaders in the field, and and people whose work that we look up to. But then when I read your bios, I was reminded of just how lucky we are to have the five of you on this panel. So thank you very much for joining us. I'll just do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll turn to the panel. So we have with us today Rahul from the Wadhwani Institute of AI, who's the Chief Research and Innovation Officer. Rahul is an MIT TR35 awardee, a World Economic Forum Social Entrepreneur of the Year, Industrial Design Society of America Gold winner, and an Echoing Green Fellow. He holds an MS PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford University, where he worked across machine learning and applied physics. He's also an alumnus of Stanford D School and has a BTech from IIT Madras. He was also the co-founder and president of Embrace, a venture-backed Stanford startup that has helped over 300,000 premature babies in over 25 developing countries, and whose product the WHO recognized as the top innovation in global health. Thanks, Rahul, for joining us. We also have with us Vidushi, who's a senior program officer with Article 19. She's an Indian lawyer and researcher working on the societal implications of AI. She leads global engagement and research on the human rights implications of machine learning at Article 19, and her work has been cited by the Supreme Court of India in a seminal ruling on the right to privacy, as well as the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression. Thanks, Vidushi, for joining us. We also have with us Umakant Soni. Umakant is the founder and CEO of ARTPARK, a nonprofit working to create AI and robotics research translation ecosystem in an inclusive way. He's also the co-founder of AI Foundry, a venture studio to build and leapfrog AI companies for 6 billion people. Before this, Umakant co-founded Pi Ventures, which has backed some of the leading AI companies in India. With an exposure to AI for almost a decade, he is a much sought after technology and business strategist and advisor in the area of AI for Government of India initiatives for Niti Aayog, as well as the Department of Science and Technology and NETI. Welcome, Umakant. Sorry we didn't get to have a round of introductions before we started. Thank you for joining us. We also have with us Vrinda. Vrinda is a Rhodes Scholar. She's a lawyer first, and then she's a Rhodes Scholar who graduated from the University of Oxford, the double masters in law and public policy. She's a litigating lawyer in Delhi and specializes in the field of digital rights, technology, and privacy. She's also been part of the Aadhaar Challenge, the restoration of internet in Jammu and Kashmir, a challenge to the constitutionality of the surveillance regime in India, Arogya Setu, and most recently, the consultation process adopted for the National Digital Health ID. And last but certainly not least, we also have with us, hi Vrinda, thank you for joining us. Last but not least, we also have with us Danish. Danish is a senior AI researcher at IBM Research, and he has worked on research solutions for many real-world applications using machine learning and natural language processing. His research contributions have been incorporated into multiple IBM products and services, including IBM Watson, IBM's flagship cloud-based dialogue platform. Danish is also one of the co-founders of the Responsible AI Licenses Initiative, and he also serves the chair of the IEEE P2840 Standard Working Group on Responsible AI Licensing. And in 2018, Danish was named as an Innovator Under 35 in India by the MIT Review magazine. So I'm sure you'd all agree that we're really lucky to have all 5 of you join us for this panel discussion. Thank you very much. So we will just again, a quick housekeeping. We will have a moderated discussion with our 5 panelists for about the next half hour or so. Please do post any questions that you have. And I know I had said that you can post them in the chat function, but actually, if you don't mind, I would prefer if you post them in the Q&A function. It just makes my life a little bit easier because I don't have to go back into the chat. And there are, and I have made note of the questions that that were posed during Angelina's presentation as well. Great. So Rahul, maybe I can start with you, if that's okay. Rahul, so you work closely with government. I mean, you are in the field, right? And whether it's COVID or agriculture or healthcare, and numerous accounts in the press in the past years have highlighted mishandling of data by both public and private actors. So in recent times, for an example, the CBSA dismissed the need for a strong privacy policy to roll out facial recognition attendance systems because it called it a simple face matching app. Right. So based on your experience on working with both government and the private sector, can you reflect a little bit on the institutional capacity and the knowledge gaps in India when it comes to the deployment of AI? And what are the kind of steps that are needed to improve this situation, if you agree with the reading of this situation, of course?
Yeah, sure. Certainly, like you already mentioned, and Angelina mentioned, there's lots of potential for use of AI solutions in public programs. But when you have that kind of potential for that kind of scale and impact, you also have potential for great harm, right, if not done responsibly. Certainly there's well-known gaps when it comes to data privacy and security. And I don't think there's any new things that I have to offer there in pointing out lacunae that need to be filled. In addition to that, I would say maybe just based on my experience looking at multiple sectors, a few additional areas beyond privacy and security that I think need attention. One is AI. When one thinks of standards around any of these technologies, right? I use the analogy with chemistry. One doesn't regulate chemistry, right? One regulates pharmaceuticals, one regulates pesticides, one regulates chemical weapons. Right? So regulations have to be application specific, standards are application specific. And in similar vein, AI applications have to be governed based on norms around applications. And that's actually how in practice, even as norms are evolving, as standards are evolving, that's how it's playing out. So for, and if I were to actually take, um, you mentioned diabetic retinopathy. So if a health department were to roll that out, the evaluation of that technology would be done by a particular health department. Right? And the sort of gaps I see are one, um, having credible evaluation mechanisms and a regulatory agency that has the ability to evaluate. Um, the health department is typically staffed with medical professionals and public health professionals and administrators, not necessarily set up to evaluate technology. And that's one big gap I see. As part of the evaluation standard is also of course, evaluating against, for example, bias. But simple things like you don't want to be evaluating against one test set. You have to evaluate across multiple strata. For example, you do want to evaluate performance across genders. You want to evaluate performance across age. You want to evaluate with performance across comorbidities and so on. Right? So there's nuance involved in evaluating, and standards need to be established for this, and capabilities need to be established to be able to do this. Otherwise, there's potential for great harm. Second thing I'd say is any evaluation should not just be around algorithms. So some of these things I mentioned are around performance of algorithms, but assessment should be done at the level of a system, right? The algorithm is only one part of an AI solution being deployed, and that's where other aspects like privacy, security, rights to redressal, for example, right, have to be addressed. When if I may be subject to an opaque decision. And finally, I'd say there's also a need for capability. If and I say this in many fora, you've heard me say this before, Urvashi. One of the most important things in AI solutions is actually post-deployment monitoring. Right? You cannot possibly anticipate all the adverse consequences possible. And especially in a system that learns, you need post-deployment monitoring. And so for these, for whatever agency deploys solutions, there has to be capacity built for post-deployment monitoring. And right now, I don't see those capacities built. There's a sense of how traditional technologies are deployed, which is I develop technology, I evaluate, I pilot. Once I have a large scale pilot, I deploy, and then no one's constantly monitoring it anymore.
So would that I mean, just picking up on your last point on the post deployment monitoring, so would that then also suggest, I mean, what that says to me also is that a lot of what the action is in the post deployment stage, right? And we need to focus on that. So would you also then suggest that certain kinds of applications, which are perhaps high risk applications, there should be different thresholds for them?
Absolutely. So I think if the deployment of AI in public sector has to um, draw from one historical domain where there can be much learned from, it's actually in medical technologies, because it's yet another domain where the recipient of the beneficiary of the technology, in that case the patient, doesn't, or in the AI solution the citizen, doesn't always know what goes into actually the underlying technology. Often the person applying the technology, which is in healthcare, often it's the doctor. Even the doctor may not know all the innards of a medical technology, right? And where again there's a long history of having to requiring post-deployment monitoring. Yes, the standards, the thresholds are determined based on potential harm, right? You look at, I mean, you typically do a risk evaluation, and what you want to do is mitigate. I mean, the do no harm principle applies, right? You want to mitigate possible harm, and that's typically evaluated based on the probability of harm and the severity of harm. Right? And both are taken into consideration, and then you take reasonable steps to mitigate. Always keeping in mind, so post-deployment, what you try and prevent through post-deployment monitoring is only residual unknowns, right? It's the unknown unknowns that you want to catch from post-deployment monitoring. The known harms should be caught before deployment. You just have to accept that there will be unknown unknowns.
Right. Vidushi, maybe I can bring you in here. So, recently Niti Aayog has proposed a framework for responsible AI, where they do propose a risk-based approach to thinking about the governance of AI, and we see this kind of approach also being put forth by the EU. You've written about rights-based approaches to the governance of AI. So, could you reflect a little bit on those two, and how would you assess a risk-based approach vis-a-vis a rights-based approach?
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here, Urvashi, and thanks, Rahul. You've set me up very well for my answer. So I think the rationale for having a risk-based approach is usually to say, even in the Niti Aayog document, it says we need to be context specific, we need to be agile, we need to, not subscribe to like one size fits all assumptions about AI. And so we need to like assess risk at the level of the application. I think the problem arises though when we realize that firstly, risks are different for individuals and for communities. So there's no real baseline against which we're understanding risk. And anyone who has ever worked on a machine learning system will tell you that impact assessments would be a perfect way in which we could avoid any sort of societal harm. And so I think having risk-based approaches is good in terms of not subscribing to blanket approaches to AI, but it cannot be an end in and of itself. The reason that I think a rights-based approach works well is because it sets up a baseline against which you can assess applications, even when those unknowns, as Rahul mentioned, come into play at a later point. And also with the risk-based approach, how do you look at competing risks between different individuals? How do you look at competing risks between different stakeholders? I think if we subscribe to the context-based approach, you'll always have the incumbent powerful stakeholder kind of being able to determine and shape what risk looks like. I will say this was a huge bone of contention even when we were working on it in the EU. A lot of folks thought that the high risk versus low risk categorization was also harmful because it kind of precluded conversations around red lines. So, if something is high risk, you regulate it more strictly and the regulator pays more attention to it. But then what about, applications that shouldn't be there at all? I don't think it's a perfect solution. I don't think a rights-based solution is perfect either, but I think, a combination of the two is necessary for us to have like some sort of accountability mechanisms that go through the life cycle of AI systems. And I think the over-reliance on any one will have very, very expensive and costly outcomes and implications.
Thanks, Vidushi. I mean, you brought up the issue of red lines, right? And we see many jurisdictions this year have passed laws prohibiting certain types of AI use, particularly around automated facial recognition systems. So, and you have worked extensively on facial recognition and also emotional recognition, if I recall correctly. So, what is the scope of such legislation in the Indian context?
I think it was a funny moment, right, in July and June of this year when we were looking at the automated face recognition system in India, being used and piloted and tested across the country, and then at the same time you have like giants like IBM and Google and whatnot saying that they wouldn't be using facial recognition. I think there's like some sort of inherent inconsistency between the two. And the reason I think that we're seeing such a stark difference in how we're embracing facial recognition and how other jurisdictions are kind of like walking away from it is that current policy approaches in India don't really reckon with the limitations of facial recognition. So even if you look at, face recognition being used to find missing children in Delhi and being used to surveil protesters and things like that, there is an assumption either that it is a useful and legal way in which you can surveil people or that it is a technology that works. And so that's why we have, the AFRS tender being delayed 13, 14 times. It's the hope that the government doesn't seem to give up on. And I think it's actually quite dangerous because not only are we losing time, we're also seeing that facial recognitions are proliferating around the country, which makes rolling them back at a later stage much, much more difficult. I would argue that actually the main obstacle to, effectively regulating against the harms of facial recognition is that these systems are already out in the open. So even if we know that they're harmful, even if we know that they don't work, even if we know they're a sunken cost for governments and for companies, it's difficult to roll them back. And so I think the regulatory regime of facial recognition in India, I don't know if I sound overly cynical, but I don't see, a red lines approach occurring anytime soon, although I would hope for it. You mentioned, some of the more emerging forms of technology that I've been working on, including emotion recognition. And I think there it's quite exciting in a morose kind of way to imagine ways in which the government can anticipate harms in ways that other jurisdictions haven't. So for those who aren't familiar with emotion recognition, it's basically biometric technology that claims to be able to infer your inner emotional state based on your external appearances, based on your gait, usually based on your facial expressions. And so the argument there, the regulatory argument there is, at least for someone like me, is to say actually the scientific assumptions that underlie all of this, the assumptions around how we express ourselves, what feelings and emotions have to do with each other, our feelings and expressions have to do with each other, those are inherently problematic. They're based on racist, often Nazi science. We shouldn't be building those systems anyway. We shouldn't even be thinking about optimizing those systems. We shouldn't be thinking about how to minimize risks and harms from those systems. So an anticipatory ban on these kinds of technologies is warranted. And we're seeing some glimmers of that, in the EU and part of a digital rights group called the European Digital Rights Group. And we've kind of argued that emotion recognition should be banned outright. I know the AI Now Institute has said that because of shaky foundational, all of this to say, I think there's a lot to be done. But in order for regulation to actually move in the direction that I'm talking about, we'd need to have a much more sobering conversation about what artificial intelligence systems cannot do, shouldn't do, and are not well equipped to do.
Thanks, Vidushi. Vrinda, maybe I can turn to you now, because I know you've also been thinking about this issue a bit, about red lines, about facial recognition. So how can we address this issue with legislation? And maybe, a piggyback question on that is that, what are the challenges in accessing information around automated systems from the state during litigation?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Urvashi. So, I think, again, like Vidushi is also setting up perfectly. I think when we look at what is the scope of legislation, I really think before we even talk about an AI specific or a facial recognition technology specific legislation, we really just do need to acknowledge that we still don't have a personal data protection bill. And so that's like the absolute bare minimum. It was interesting to me to see that the Niti Aayog document on responsible AI actually says that there are relevant legal protections for AI-related concerns largely exist, although they need to adopt. I wouldn't even agree that these relevant legal protections largely exist. The general overarching legal framework in India right now is the Information and Technology Act, which is really outdated. And more importantly, just also not effective in terms of actual grievance redress. So you've not had a cyber appellate tribunal for very long. There was no chief of the cyber appellate tribunal. So just even having appeals, those appeals were not being heard. So I think we really need to focus on having a personal data protection bill, for a reason that although the Puttaswamy judgment has come, and so, privacy is a fundamental right, and certain principles of purpose limitation and collection limitation are now recognized in law, because of the nature of fundamental rights and how they operate in India, they exist only against the state. So in terms of any grievance against, so you have a dichotomy where the Information Technology Act, Section 43A doesn't apply to the government. It only applies to the state, but is heavily inadequate. And then you have all your fundamental right protections against which, it is very hard to use those fundamental right protections against private companies. So to really regulate AI, I think at the very minimum, we need to have the personal data protection bill, and we need to have a lot of conversations around the exemption provisions in the bill itself. So, both Angelina and even Vidushi's work has spoken about the use of facial recognition technology and AI in law enforcement, right? And the way the PDP bill is currently structured, the government really can almost exempt the entire application of the act. So, we talk about needing a law, but then if the law just exempts the entire application and says you don't need to follow purpose limitation, you don't need to follow like reasonable processing, you don't need to follow fair processing, you really are limiting the scope of legislation. So I think one, obviously we need to have a data protection law. I think what is interesting, and we saw this in the UK, is that having a legal framework is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So in the UK, when it comes to law enforcement, you have the UK Data Protection Act, you have a surveillance camera code of practice, and then there are local policies that are being used by the police. And so there was a Court of Appeals judgment, the Ed Bridges case that came out in 2020, where the court actually said that even though there was an existing legal framework, it was inadequate. It didn't fit in the quality of law test. So, it was not accessible enough. It was not foreseeable enough. And the court essentially said that what the current legal framework fails is it fails in answering the who question and the where question. So they say that there is too much discretion, which is currently left to individual police officers in terms of who can be placed on a watch list when it comes to AI for law enforcement purposes. And it is also not clear that what is the criteria for determining when automated facial recognition systems can be used. So, I mean, we are sort of at this system where we're saying, let's have a law. And, the debate in other countries is, what are the elements of a law? Is it, does it satisfy the quality of law test? I think the second thing is, when you look at existing laws, apart from the IT Act, you also want to be focusing on amending or updating other laws such as consumer protection and, improving grievous redressal mechanisms there and making those laws relevant even in terms of how they could apply for AI. I think one thing we do need to consider whenever we talk about any specific legislation is, do we want to legislate a particular technology? Because the technology will often outpace the law. Or do you want to have a law that will at least set out certain broad principles that will remain in place? And part of this is also, we know how hard it is to have a central government pass a law on these issues. So when you have the chance to do that, you want to make sure that the principles will remain solid for the next 20 years. I mean, even you in your introduction said how from 2018 to 2020, there's been a vast movement in how AI has expanded. And so, you want a legislation that's going to be valid and relevant for the next 10, 20 years. And I think in terms of what should a law contain, I mean, I think the general principles that a law must focus on are obviously things like consent, an importance on the respect for context, importance of transparency, security by design, privacy by design, integrity, accuracy, accountability. I think one thing that often does get missed in these principles is really having a good grievance redressal system, because that's one of those things that's not as sexy. It's not an easy principle to implement because it actually requires resources, it requires training. And I think that is really important in how citizens will interact with a regulator. So you have the PDP bill and you have the Data Protection Authority that is proposed under the bill, which has these wide-ranging powers, right? Which you may believe is a really good idea. You need a regulator. But then who has the power to appoint the regulator? It's completely the central government. There is absolutely no, not even leaders of opposition, no experts, no outside bodies. So when the independence of the regulator is under question, who is in charge of their terms of service, who is in charge for their salaries, can their salaries be varied? I think these are also very important questions to talk about. We saw this in the RTI debate. So the RTI Act had this very minor amendment to the terms and service, but that has played a huge role in the independence of PIOs and CIC officers, etc. So I think it is important to also then have certain specific principles that are obviously specific to AI. So the importance of discrimination, importance of safety and reliability when you talk about private sector use. So that's your first question. Coming to the second question, in terms of what are some of the unique challenges in accessing information, regarding automated systems during litigation. I think obviously some of this is that information is not necessarily always put out proactively. So it is about finding that information, which I think you can do in three ways. At least that's how those are the kinds of means I've used in the recent past with varying degrees of success before filing any legal challenge. One, parliamentary questions. There is a surprising amount of data that's available when it comes to parliamentary questions. And I think a lot of organizations have actually started compiling parliamentary questions relating to IT issues, every term. So I think that's one important area, especially if you can get your MP or a specific MP to raise certain questions, that's very helpful. The second is obviously the RTI route. So that is probably what is going to give you the most information, like the most specific information. We've seen it used. So the Internet Freedom Foundation has done a lot of work when it comes to facial recognition technology through using the RTI route and finding out details. And some of the information that one can find relates to, what is the scope of the project? What are the costs involved in the project? What is the legality of the source of legality as per the government for the project? What are the technical details regarding accuracy? We saw, Saurav Das used a lot of this when it came to Arogya Setu recently. So, what was the involvement of private sectors? At what element, at what element was private sectors involved, and was it paid, and is it pro bono? Some of the questions that people were asking, even Angelina, some of these questions should be available to us through RTI. The problem obviously becomes that the officers, the public information officers, are very happy to also use the exemption provisions. So whether it's Section 8 or Section 24, they kind of just use exemption provisions. And so then you're left with filing a first appeal. And then, you talk about a breakdown of a system. So the second appeal takes 2 years for it to come in regular cases. So, again, your RTI system then breaks down at that end. And I think the third and final way is actually sending a legal notice itself. So for instance, the fact that the AFRS relies on a cabinet note of 2009 as the source of legality came out in their response to a legal notice that they had sent, in their response to a legal notice that had been sent by IFF. So in some cases, if you have an agency that's willing to respond, that's very helpful. And I think the reason all of this becomes very important is, remember, when you're litigating as the petitioner side, you just have very limited information compared to the government. It's hard for you to demonstrate, the proportionality test to show that there is a least restrictive alternative unless you have all of that data. And we saw this in Aadhaar, where the petitioners were hamstrung in terms of, what was their ability to present this data versus the state when, the UIDI chief came and gave a presentation on the security and reliability of Aadhaar, and there was no cross-examination allowed. And so you are in a place of asymmetric power. So I think this really has implications when it comes to litigating. I think I've spoken enough. So yeah, I'll if there's any further questions, I'd be happy to take them later on.
Yeah, thanks for that, Vrinda. I think there was, in particular, the second part of what you were saying in terms of the strategies. I think that was really, really useful, and certainly not something that I'm familiar with or have thought too much about. So thanks for that. Danish, maybe I can turn to you now and, take a slightly bit, and I think you come at it from a slightly different approach, right? So, over the years, we've seen several incidents have highlighted the danger of, for an example, right, like conversational AI and their bots that can distort political dialogue and debate, right? Yet conversational AI is also in use in applications that address mental health. Angelina spoke about one such case study where, they actually noted fairly kind of privacy protecting practices, or they provide customer assistance, etc. So given that many AI systems can be used for a variety of purposes, where should regulation be focused? Does one examine the risks in a use by use kind of case, or is it the scale of impact? And I was hoping maybe you could also reflect a little bit here on some of the work that you've been doing around the responsible AI licensing initiative, right? Could you tell us more about this and maybe link it to how we can regulate AI systems that are then used for a variety of purposes?
Thanks. So I think in all of this discussion that we were talking about regulation and things like that, I think the first thing that comes up is this whole implementation aspect of regulation, right? How would you implement such a thing? As Rahul was stating earlier, that a lot of the discussion gets lost if you don't have end use or domain specific terms that are well defined. So for example, if you take simple things like explainability or interpretability, right? What does that even mean from an implementation point of view? A regulation can't get over the fact that it's not something that's well defined. For example, what is interpretability? Is it interpretable by a human being? Is it a special kind of human being? Somebody who understands AI systems or somebody who understands the end application? What is the degree of explainability? You need to then break that down maybe by the modalities involved, the areas of application, right? If it's a self-driving car, or if it's doing image recognition, if it's doing insurance fraud detection, why did a self-driving car collide with object X and not object Y? Why why did a tweet, right, on for customer service agents get prioritized? If I was an airline, I was furious with an airline and I tweeted and my tweet did not get priority. Do I have the right to have an explainable answer from the airline company to say why did my tweet not get priority? Where do you need explainability? Where do you not? You have these sorts of issues come up in every aspect of the terms we discussed. For transparency, fairness. You need to start thinking of how you want to define all of this. And I think that's where some of the challenges that start coming to play with legislation, because legislation can do very high level things unless you break them down per domain, per application, per instance of what you're wanting to protect or protect against. So, you could always say that an AI system, and it's not a complete clause, let's say, but an AI system should always be used to augment human intelligence, and should not any decision being taken by an AI system should be reviewed by a human, and then they should have the authority and the ability to both reason with or then override that decision, right? And that the responsibility for that decision actually lies with the human being. Even a simple thing like this, you need to start thinking about, where does this policy apply? Does it apply for when you're recommending a song to somebody? No, right? I mean, it's fine if there is no human oversight as to why a song was recommended to me. But if it is for learning, but if it is for social media news, or if it's for things like that, maybe at some point, some human intervention needs to happen. Even thinking about where all of that fits in is challenging. And I think that's where I started thinking about, with some colleagues, on licensing as an approach, right? Where you don't have an overarching law to comply with necessarily, because you're supposed to do that anyway. But there are certain aspects of a technology, as a technology creator, that you understand better than anybody else. When you develop something, it is possibly okay to use that in a very narrow sense, maybe only for that. Or maybe there are ways you definitely don't want it being used because it has either not been tested, it's inappropriate, or maybe it doesn't comply with your ethical view of things. And that's the idea of licensing, because licensing, if you include a clause, right? And so the way licensing works is, today, we are using, a lot of AI has been built on openness, right? People share code on GitHub. A lot of code is picked up, rebuilt, repackaged, and then built into something bigger. You do this in academia for improving state of the art. You're also seeing startups using some of the code that has been made open source by researchers and developers. Now, the thing is, would people have anticipated in ways in which code would have been repurposed, or technology that was made open source and made available being repurposed? Not necessarily. And that's where if technology providers or technology creators put in restrictive use clauses or permissive use clauses, then the question is, could you actually just rely on contractual and copyright law in some sense to enforce some of those norms, while larger legislative principles around AI are still being defined or being developed? Because it is hard, right? As we all agree that these things aren't very clear. You need to think about domains and applications. So could we not, in the meantime, at least, or as a complementary task, as a complementary process, at least have some controls put in at the point of release? Now, you do see that in some forms that it's coming to play, right? Like OpenAI, for example, initially refused to release GPT-2 to the wider public. Like, they said, we won't release the code because we're worried about its harms. That is one way of, it wasn't a license, but then it was, maybe restricted access to those technologies. But then this has to happen at a much wider scale. So if I build an image recognition algorithm that can be used for X, maybe I want it only to be used for X and not for mass surveillance or something like that. And those are things that one can hopefully do. I'm not a legal expert, but hopefully, do within frameworks of contractual and copyright law, by stating that if I identify somebody violating the terms of service, at least I have the ability to stop them from using that further, if nothing else.
Danish, but is there a risk there that you have a select few private actors taking fairly consequential and large decisions? And I would also, a related point to that is that, if you look at the kind of AI ecosystem today, it is dominated by a select few number of big tech players. And so would a kind of licensing regime like that work against democratizing or opening up the AI space? And how do we think about balancing those?
Definitely, that's definitely a risk. If if I'm a single developer and I suspect like a big corporate has used my technology in ways that I didn't anticipate, or my clauses specifically prohibited, do I have the means and resources of going after a large company? Probably not. So you're right. The ecosystem also needs to evolve accordingly. And the ecosystem is actually very nascent right now, right? Maybe there is space for certification and compliance bodies, standard development bodies, even things like saying if a machine learning system is explainable, is it truly explainable? Is it meaningfully explainable? So there is space for the ecosystem to develop a lot, but you're right. There is risk of reinforcing power structures that already exist by taking this approach, and we have to be mindful of those risks as well. But I think it also presents an opportunity where instead of having things progress and get out of hand, like I think Vidushi was mentioning, that if a system is already out there, the costs of unrolling them or bringing them back is much harder. I think it can play a role in at least mitigating some of that, while for sure there are risks of it also going harming the other objectives that we're trying to make sure we don't harm.
Yeah, I guess, I think we are, across all, what I'm hearing from everyone, obviously, is A, it's tough, but B, obviously some combination of approaches is required, right? So, I would be quite concerned about some of the unintended consequences of that kind of approach. But I guess if looking back, for an example, maybe there were certain things that could have been reined in, or certainly not rolled out, or rolled out to market way too early, and maybe licensing could have had a role there. Umakant, maybe I can turn to you now. We've been having a conversation that I think is fairly kind of India focused, right? And it'll be great to hear from you. As a nominated expert by the government on India on the global partnership for AI. So what are some of the next steps for India in this direction, right? And what is going to be the impact of India's GPAI membership on the future of AI governance activities? Can you tell us a little bit about that partnership for AI, where India sits, and how some of what you're hearing right now chimes with what you're hearing in some of these more global level conversations, of which India is now.
Yep. Absolutely. So thanks, Urvashi, for having me here. In this conversation, I think it's fantastic. I've been listening to all of you talk about some of the issues that we are seeing in India, and I was reminded of this interesting probably sentence that I came across, that nation is an abstract notion that humans believe in, not machines, right? So it's kind of funny, but we need to also look at a few of the things that probably it would work for us as a nation, and also some of the things are going to be fairly global, right? I was listening to the conversation about the facial recognition. 40% of facial recognition in India is powered by SenseTime. And this is the fact. Most of the phones actually are carrying, technology which is probably not developed in India, and and somehow that is probably going to bypass all the things that we've been talking about, and that is actually a real concern. And because what we see is that there is an unequal level of AI being developed across the nation, and GPA, I think it's really. What should I say? I think it's really fortunate that India is actually taking up a bold step here and participating in GPA, because it's actually great to actually have a voice in this global conversation on AI, given that the AI actually has this polarizing power. Anybody who amasses data and talent in AI is actually going to probably decide the technology roadmap of other countries as well. And I think that's why we actually need to have a very careful conversation about regulation in our own country, because we might be regulating the government or the other smaller developers that are actually trying to develop expertise in facial recognition, and there could be some other company from some other country which is going to score highest because they actually have unequal access to data. And they will probably may not be so much ethical about leveraging the data in our own country. So I think we need to actually have a much deeper debate on that, not just within India but actually globally as well. I think there is a very serious challenge that we have. As a species, I mean, we should talk about as a human species, right? I think definitely data talent is in the hands of either a few countries or a few companies, and that is not great for us actually as Earth, if you were to look at a broader perspective. Because if you see what's actually happening is that the innovation diversity is actually reducing at a massive clip. And I think that is where we need to step in and actually allow a sensible regulation to take place. In fact, in quite a few areas, I think we should actually advocate self-regulation if possible. And in some areas, and as I heard my good friend Rahul talk about it. It's like, yeah, you need to regulate the use of the technology, where it's actually going to be. And I think probably that's a more sensible approach. The other thing that I'm seeing, which is actually very challenging, is that there are 5. I've been in innovation space for quite some time. Being an AI entrepreneur, I started one of the very early chatbot companies in 2009-10. I set up the fund, which is focused on, again, investing in AI. And now we are building this AI research and innovation ecosystem with AI and Robotics Technology Park, which is seed funded by Department of Science and Technology and Government of Karnataka in Bangalore. So we see this very clearly. There are 5 major elements you need to actually promote inclusive innovation: data, talent, domain research, and capital, right? And if I see this, US actually has got, big companies. Nobody talks about data regulation there. We have seen that in GPay as well. On the other side, you have China, and it's very, very opaque, right? They're not ready to share anything actually now. So what is left? I mean, Europe is decimated by GDPR. There is no innovation there. I've met so many startups in Europe, and they actually lament about this fact that they have been systematically weeded out in some sense by GDPR, because the big companies now, they're setting up campuses in Paris, and they actually get to have all the talent because they actually have the data. So it's actually quite complex. I think when we start to look at not just within India, but globally, it's actually, AI is fairly geopolitical in nature. So we need to create democratic access to data, talent, research, domain. I think you can get access to, but definitely capital, right? I think if we are not able to create this democratic access, we might be over-regulating ourselves to death, just like the way Europe has done. And as a result, and that is actually very fundamental, and we should talk about is that, what is AI, right? AI is actually going to turn data into solutions, right? Now, if I look at India, right? India has this 5,000 years of history, right? Where we have actually survived as a community for a long time, right? And those best practices, or some of those sustainable best practices, are actually encoded in how we behave with each other, how we interact with each other. And when we are going to take this kind of data and convert that into AI, it might actually lead to a sustainable man-machine society of future. And that actually is really important. I feel that, I mean, all said and done, US is like 400 years old. And I can already see in China, they have this vision of autonomous machines over semi-autonomous people. I think that's not a great future for us either. I think what is actually would be really helpful is that if we can think about India as a birthplace for, autonomous machines working together with autonomous people. And I think that is very, very important. And I think that's where we need to actually have the debate that, okay, how can we have a combination of innovation, commercialization, and regulation, in some areas, self-regulation, to actually get to a responsible AI, not just for India, but actually for globally as well. Today, there is no alternative to what's actually happening in US or in China. I think we have probably the potential to actually create a third, more responsible AI front. And I think that's where we need all of us to actually collaborate and cooperate.
Thanks for that. I mean, I think, you touch upon, I think, the political economy question, right? And I think that is a very valid concern. We see a huge concentration of power in the hands of a select few actors, and there is a need to democratize that space, right? But I guess I do worry that in that aspiration to democratize that space, are we romanticizing also this space, right? I mean, I think if we think about the Indian context, despite rich cultural traditions, they have, like all societies, there are losers and there are winners and there are differences, right? And so there is the danger, I think, in the attempt to kind of rein back power from big tech companies and create a more democratic space for AI innovation, that we create new inequalities, right? So I think how do we think about that? How do we create a genuinely more inclusive and equitable innovation ecosystem that does not romanticize what the ground realities are in the Indian context, that looks at other sectors, looks at the business community, that looks at other sectors where self-regulation has in fact failed, and also certainly has shown its shortcomings. So how do we have a more realistic and honest conversation about democratizing this place without romanticizing what India can bring to the table?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's less about romanticizing. I mean, it's fine to romanticize. I mean, there's no harm in that. I think, however, I think it's a real concern. I think data access, I mean, today, and I've been investing in companies and I've looked at it, right? Like there's so many sectors with like, there's no chance for a startup to come up. I mean, autonomous driving, I mean, just to give you a fact on it, right? Like there's Waymo, which has got $2.5 billion of funding. They've completely wiped Silicon Valley clean. Forget about everybody else, right? Every single talent was doing something in autonomous driving, has folded up and actually has gone to Waymo, right? And this is just an example, which is like a very, very simple example. I talk about other examples, right? Where let's say if you're an independent developer, a small academia-led startup, even if I were to use that word, today you don't have access to data at all. And that's why you see the best researchers in Berkeley, going and working in, Facebook AI research. You look at the top 10 academic papers that are getting published today. Most of them are belonging to Google, Facebook, DeepMind, Microsoft, right? And this is where we really need to be concerned. We have to talk about innovation diversity. Why we will survive. I mean, why we have survived for such a long time is because there was some diversity. I mean, there was a company, I remember when I was actually started out my career, we used to think that, okay, SAP and Oracle are going to rule the world. But then suddenly, Linux popped up from somewhere. And that led to, a massive outgrowth of SaaS companies that actually have provided options for people to choose, right? And it has also made, of course, it's still not fully safe, but it is actually a lot more safer now, right, as a world. So we need to actually create diversity in terms of option. I think that is very, very real. Whether we do it with self-regulation combined with regulation, absolutely. We also need to look at how the geopolitical part of AI is going to play out, right? Like, you cannot have SenseTime coming in and doing facial recognition with a technology. I mean, they're beating DARPA threw out a challenge, right? And they emerged as the winners. And DARPA actually closed out that contest itself. So we need to look at this in a very holistic manner, and we need to make sure that we are also looking at, while we are beating ourselves to death over regulation, I think we also need to create a much more holistic approach in which you actually have these data banks which are privacy aware, which are secure. And maybe they need to be with academia in India. Maybe one of the things that we're trying out in ARTPARK is to actually create, privacy-aware data sets which are open for innovation. The second is the compute. I mean, today you can't compute if you're not competing with compute. I mean, why OpenAI has been able to turn out GPT-3? You dig behind a little bit and then you see that, okay, they have access to such a large amount of compute. Maybe a lot of universities don't have that kind of compute. So we need to democratize the access to really large amount of compute, even for, academia, because, here's the fact, right? Any profit-making, organization, right? At the end of the day, it has to serve its stakeholders. Facebook will actually have a hard time trying to regulate fake news, because each fake news might result in $50 million of revenue. So we have to be actually very practical and looking at like, okay, what is the real motive, right? If the motive is about, profit, and your algorithm is actually primed to increase the profit, I mean, how do you beat that? It's very, very hard. We talk about, human in the loop in the terms of regulation. It's, at the scale at which some of these systems are operating, it is super hard for even them to regulate themselves. They have lost control. I mean, I think there was one internal document that actually went public in Facebook, and that's it. I mean, you don't even know what levers to push to actually keep the fake news out. As simple as that. Now, how do you deal with that, right? And I think, so that's why I'm saying that the only way to deal with that is to actually increase innovation diversity. Maybe somebody like Google will turn up out of some of the universities in, I think the only possible place is probably US or India, and given the amount of data that is needed, which basically might actually create a more equitable future for all of us. So we need to actually increase access to data, access to capital, and of course access to talent. I mean, that is a real issue. And and one more thing I would like to actually present, because this actually got raised up in GPA as well, is that different countries have actually different maturity levels. We are not a developed nation yet. We are still developing, right? For so many people, and we've been looking at financial inclusion. I mean, a guy on the street, he doesn't have any asset except probably the data that he's creating. Now, if he is denied access to use that data to actually create a better outcome for himself, that could be a major tragedy. So we need to actually look at the aspect of responsible AI in three perspectives. One, what's the technology maturity that we are in? Second, what is the as a geopolitical maturity in terms of the region, right? Where are we in that? And third is that what are the applications that actually make sense for us, and what is it that probably we need to regulate in terms of okay, this is not where we should go. I don't know whether I was able to touch upon what you asked.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, I think the points that you raise around kind of compute power, talent, etc. I mean, I think those are points that have been raised by other speakers well documented in the literature as well. I would love to come back to the data question, and Rahul, maybe that's something we can pick up with you. And we're seeing now conversations around small data for AI, for an example, right? And so, how does the conversation around small data change or shape some of these kind of geopolitical considerations or geopolitical debates that we're having? But we have a lot of questions coming in, and I am really conscious of the time. So I'm going to start taking a few questions and maybe go in the order that we had the initial remarks. So Rahul, if I could start with you, there's a question for you on the idea of regulatory sandboxes for critical applications of AI. So do you think this is viable in the Indian regulatory ecosystem? And can you think of a use case where it would be particularly useful? If you can find a way to somehow weave in my question about small data into that, that's totally fine as well. Over to you.
I think I'll answer your question first, Urvashi. It's of course, it's a goal of AI to actually work with lesser and lesser data and have comparable performance with lesser and lesser data. And in fact, big data is a relatively new phenomenon, right? I mean, for many decades before big data happened, AI research focused on working with small data, or in fact, was not even data driven. There is frontier work happening, and I would say this is not so, and the benefits of this is not restricted to India, right? It's across application domains. If you could actually work with lesser data, then you have the or even have there's many of these domains where performance just has to be above a threshold. It's beyond a threshold. It's higher performance is not what differentiates success, right? And therefore in all those domains, I'd say if with small data you can get there, then it opens up possibilities for many players. this also can help address the long tail problem that AI has, right? Which otherwise is like AI applications are able to address sort of the the bulk of the use cases, but then once you get into edge cases, they start failing, and then the cost of actually tackling edge cases is very high because collecting that data is high, and so on. So the small data, I mean, techniques that allow one to work with small data will help that as well. And of course, I would say, there are also certain domains where by the nature of the domain, the data will be small, right? So for example, if you look at drug development, right? In many cases, data will be small. If you look at, if you look at failure mode analysis for critical equipment, often, you may not have large install bases, right? And again, you'll have to work with small data. So um, the AI world at large is looking forward to that time of getting to small data and getting to work with small systems that work with small data. And there is a belief that this is fundamentally possible. And that belief that this is fundamentally possible comes not just from recent advances, but also the fact that, um, the benchmark we have for AI is actually us as humans. And a child doesn't need to be shown thousands of cats to be able to start recognizing cats. You show a child one cat or two cats or three cats, and then child learns the category of cats, right? As an example. So we realize that this is not a fundamental limitation of computation, and that we just haven't gotten there. Um, sorry. And could you remind me of the second question, Urvashi?
Regulatory sandboxes.
Regulatory sandboxes. Yeah, I mean, certainly very important. And in fact, many domains, not just AI, but actually many domains involving data have proposed this. So for example, recent material from the National Health Authority has proposed regulatory sandboxes, right? And there are similar proposals in other domains like agriculture, etc. The in the US, we see this with self-driving technology, where various cities have offered regulatory sandboxes, right, where they are given the ability to test technology. Regulatory sandboxes have a long history in technology development, and I think it can be a great boon to, especially to smaller companies, to startups, because if it weren't for that, large companies would have a disproportionate advantage because they will have the ability to sort of invest all the safety mechanisms needed to mitigate large risks that regulatory sandboxes otherwise mitigate, for one. I would say regulatory sandboxes also provide a second advantage, which is in many of the domains we're talking about that are of public benefit. Uh, it has the potential to standardize demonstration of performance, right? It allows benchmarking because you can demonstrate performance within a given sandbox, as opposed to each one coming to, let's say, a government department showing performance on sort of varied sets and varied situations. So it's a very sensible thing to do in any technology development, and certainly makes sense in AI.
Right, thanks. And I really appreciate the comments on small data. I think sometimes this doesn't get raised enough in these conversations. And I mean, as always, the policy community is well behind the technologists and their understanding of the latest tech. Vidushi, maybe a question for you. Going back, and I'm sorry we're jumping. I guess there's so much to discuss, and there's a lot of different types of questions. But there's a question I think on which you'd be best placed to answer, which is on back to the facial recognition question or emotion detection. So, are red lines at a geography specific, at a national level, sufficient for tech like facial recognition or emotion detection? And at what point do we think these red lines need to be driven by supranational bodies?
Thanks for that, Vidushi, and thank you for the question. I think it's an incredibly timely question because I mentioned, the June developments in the US, where after the murder of George Floyd, you had big tech companies coming out and saying that we're not going to sell facial recognition anymore. We have a 1-year moratorium on this in the US. which was kind of like getting really good news and then bad news right after, because it went to show that like while the priorities of certain companies were changing in one jurisdiction, they would remain unchanged in others, and that kind of like goes to show the inherent limitation of nation specific red lines. I think another aspect that kind of adds weight to this argument is that we see a lot of technology procurement, use, development, sale through export. A recent Amnesty report showed how Dutch companies, for example, are the ones who are selling emotion recognition to Xinjiang in China, which isn't something that we would assume right off the bat, and that kind of goes to show that we need actually international standards for what export controls look like. I don't think we need to confine ourselves to moratoriums or red lines. I think we need to be creative in our approach about export controls, procurement standards, technical standardization bodies that allow for certain standards to exist or not, and they have a huge impact on what kind of technologies we see in the world. So I think the supranational piece of the puzzle is an incredibly important one. I just don't want to see it confined to the realm of policy. I would love to apply it in technical standardization bodies, in trade agreements, in consumer protection agreements, in competition agreements. And I think that's kind of the gold standard for how we go ahead with that.
Thanks, Vidushi. Vrinda, there's a question about the transparency in the use of AI in public services. So what does that mean? And is that at all possible? Would you like to take that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think transparency in the use of AI services would entail proactive disclosure on the part of governments of the scope of the service provider being used, or if it's an RFP, like all the various parameters. It would also have to involve what are the costs that are going to be entailed, because at the end of the day, this is all public exchequer money, right? So you are talking about a prioritization that is happening one way or the other. So I think it's important to know what the costs of the project are. What are the technical parameters that are being used? So I mean, even when it comes to accuracy, etc., there's a lot of independent reporting. So in England, when the police was using facial recognition technology, there was an independent review that was commissioned, and that the police had sort of participated in with the university, where they were seeing what the accuracy of that facial recognition technology was. And I think transparency would be great if you had a similar partnership where the use of FRT, I mean, like you've said, and everyone has said, the use of FRT or AI applications in the last 2 years have really skyrocketed. And so given that it's being used anywhere, is it even effective, right? Because I mean, I think that's just a claim we do need to interrogate, and that does become important in any legal challenge as well. So I think having an independent review or an independent study would be great, so that data is opened out to other independent experts and not just the government. And I think other transparency parameters would just really talk about what is the intended use of the project, because that will help set a certain purpose limitation. So I think Vidushi talked about the Delhi High Court judgment, right? So there's a Delhi High Court judgment, Sadan Haldar, where the court had authorized the use of AI for the specific purpose of tracking missing children. And then the government is using that judgment, or the police is using that judgment as a justification for then using facial recognition technology in the context of the entire AFRS system, right? And so then that's why I think purpose limitation becomes important, even in these documents that you're putting out publicly. And I think the second aspect of transparency would obviously be reduced reliance on RTI exemptions. So actually proactively answering all questions, doing it within 30 days. I think that would be the second element of this.
Thanks for that, Vrinda. Danish, maybe there's a question here about the group's thoughts on the robustness of AI principles and ethics discourses from big tech companies, and can they be the face of this agenda? I'm not sure what the last part means, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on some of what we see coming out from big tech companies, and link it back to maybe points around self-regulation and the bit around kind of licensing, which is a form of self-regulation.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure what the term robustness means here in terms of what I think. there is, in general, there is this fear, and we're seeing that happen, is that, there are these big claims of ethical principles being made by not just big tech, but a lot of technology providers across the board, that they want to be X, Y, and Z. I think it is not translating adequately enough to the ground. And I think the challenges there are not just because there is no intent. I think the mechanisms for enabling that are also not adequately in place. So if, for example, a technology company wants to heavily put in safeguards and controls over their, over their software, then the ecosystem also needs to be receptive to those kinds of safeguards and controls need to be there, because you'll often hear that maybe clients don't want to complicate their licenses so much, or clients don't want to have so many contractual obligations in place. So there are things like that that also need to be like the whole ecosystem needs to be aware of the risks of AI, or the mindless application of AI also. I think, just going back to something that Umakant was saying earlier, right? This whole idea that AI will turn data into something meaningful is not necessarily true. And everybody needs to be aware of, the possible harms or the intended consequences of the technology that they're willing to either purchase or license or deploy. And that needs to be thought through in all of these things. So I think the just going back to that one line statement about robustness of ethical principles, I think more needs to be done, not just from big tech, but from, the AI ecosystem in general. But I think you're right, there is fear that not much, and rightly, that there is not much changing on the ground in terms of how systems are being applied across the board without potential safeguards being in place.
Yeah, I think that's a worry that is certainly something that I mean something that I notice. On one hand, obviously we are seeing a lot of AI ethics principles coming out from big tech companies, but on the other hand, we're seeing a range of very intrusive and harmful applications also being rolled out, right? So it's the left hand, right hand, both not speaking to each other or speaking to each other and intentionally doing things differently. So I think that does raise, I mean, to me, it raises serious questions about the efficacy of self-regulation. And maybe that's a good segue back to you, Umakant. There was a bunch of questions for you, and I'll just put some of them together. One was on, can you think of any other examples of effective self-regulation in other sectors that you can suggest that perhaps we can learn from? And the other question for you, which I'm not sure we'll have enough time to answer, but I'll put this here, is, and this is from Deepak, on how do you see the role of Swedish innovation in agency Vinnova vis-a-vis Niti Aayog?
Sure. So I think the first question, I think it's kind of interesting. The way we see, in some sense, of course, there are large companies and there are smaller companies, but in a larger context, right? If you're talking about, purely from looking at, innovation, commercialization, and how do we use, you've got a new tool, right? Now, the big challenge is like, we talk about, there is a need to self-regulate. And one of the interesting example could be, the car industry, the seat belts, they were not invented, early on, right? But in the middle, there is an inventor who figured out that if you actually use seat belts, then you reduce car accidents, right? And, and there were these big companies which actually did not, advocate the use of seatbelt for quite some time. But this innovation caught on, right? And because the cars, and people realize that, like, if the cars actually have seatbelts, they probably have less chances of dying from the accidents. And people started buying those cars. And so, of course, the self-regulation did take a bit of while to catch on, but it actually did, right? So whether you say ratings systems, I mean, all of these actually work on a kind of self-regulation coming from, users and saying, okay, this is the direction, people need to go. The challenge, and I think I understand that part with self-regulation, is also that it takes time to actually build up to a certain steam, right? And there could be dangers that we are not seeing, right? Which might take some time for the public opinion to, come together. And you might actually, and that's where probably regulation needs to step in and say, okay, hey, we are, 6, 7, 8, 10 experts, and they have diverse perspectives, but they agree that, okay, this application needs to be self-regulated. And I think using facial recognition to target somebody to kill, definitely that needs to get regulated. I mean, we are starting to see some, applications on that, although unconfirmed, but I think that's something that definitely needs to get regulated on. The second part, which was like, I think Vinova. So I think Vinova, the corresponding agency in India is Department of Science and Technology. Not Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog is more about planning, and they actually have probably a strategy ministry or something in Sweden. But I think, yeah, this actually is something, that is out there. I think self-regulation and regulation both need to work together. That's what I feel. And of course, for self-regulation to happen, the role of, evangelization of the dangers is actually also important. And that's where I think the fantastic work that you guys are doing is also appreciated.
I think the seatbelt story is also quite interesting, because I mean, I could be totally wrong on this, so I apologize in advance. But I think there were many more women died initially in the early years of the seatbelt, because the seatbelt was not optimized for women passengers, right? All the testing and training had been done on men of a certain physique. So I think that if just going with that analogy, that is also possibly one of the dangers or one of the shortcomings of self-regulation, that you're able to cater or you're able to respond to a certain select population, right? Perhaps a population that you relate best to, or perhaps a population that is dominant in a society.
So in fact, one of the, just to address to that point, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, self-regulation also needs some kind of behavior modifying actions, right? So I think one of the things that we are actually proposing in GPay is to actually have these auditing services around ethics and maybe, certifying people to say, okay, this is a fair use AI, right? And that has to be an international body, right? Because we are already seeing that, technology doesn't, understand the national boundaries in some sense, right? So it becomes super difficult to actually regulate that. So there has to be a global, international certifying agencies or bodies which will actually allow us to say, okay, this is fair. I mean, it doesn't have to go into full regulation, but it's like, okay, I actually, have this mark of this, fairness on you, and maybe this is good to go, this is not good to go. And as a consumer, then you can actually take an informed decision and say, okay, I'm going to actually vote here. Maybe it's expensive, but I know that probably this will be a better, chance for us to actually have a more balanced man-machine society in the future.
Yeah. We're unfortunately out of time. I feel like I could go on speaking to all of you for a very, very long time. But thank you so much for participating, for joining us. And thank you so much to all the participants for all your questions and for being so engaged on, it's 6 p.m. So late in the workday. Thanks very much. We will share, the video will be on YouTube, and we'll prepare a small little kind of webinar report, and we will share that with you all as well. I just quickly want to turn over to Vikram to just give a quick roundup and some thanks before we close the event.
Okay, so thank you very much to the panelists. Really exciting conversation. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes, and I think some things that really struck me. You see, the AI team or the AI work at Tandem is in some sense at a turning point. We have finished a good body of work, which was much more empirical and place-based. But as we move forward, here are a few ideas based on this conversation that I think the AI team could think about, which I thought were very interesting. So I think one of the questions that debates which was happening was around the kind of upstream versus downstream regulation of AI. And one of the frameworks that we are beginning to look at is responsible research and innovation, which comes out of Europe. And I'm increasingly interested in how both research and innovation could be regulated and to what extent that might actually work in the AI space. I work with some other imaging technologies, for example, geoengineering, and have looked at GMOs in the past. And I think the regulation of research and innovation is also something that we should kind of think about. And it's not self-regulation necessarily, but it's regulating upstream. and not just, as Rahul might have suggested, of applications in particular domains. So that's really interesting question. The second question to me is the question of risk versus rights-based framework, but I think this is a slightly more complex question. And I think the question we have to ask here is that how safe is safe enough for some of these applications? And very often the risk-based approaches are probabilistic in nature, but like nuclear safety before, we can't assign probabilities easily. It's a clash of not just uncertainty about the outcome, but also values. So what are the societal frameworks to think about risk? And I think that is really critical. And we can learn a lot from previous technologies, including, again, GMOs and nuclear tech, on this question of what are cultural frameworks to take decisions about what is safe enough, right? I think the third question that was really interesting was that around public engagement, and how do you actually, so information disclosure obviously is one part of it, but are there tools for wider societal and public engagement? Do we know what society and public wants to know, what they need to know about AI systems? There are experiments in around public engagement, for example, in nanotech and other technologies, which could be interesting to see, in the AI space, if that is one way to think about it. Yeah, so I think those are some of the things that I'm really quite excited about, and hope that the AI team will take up as we move forward into that next phase of our research. And I think with that, I just want to thank a few people. Obviously, Urvashi already mentioned FES. FES supported us for about a year on some of our AI labs and technology foresight groups, as we used to call them, and Manvi, Patrick at FES, and I see Manvi is on the call. So special thanks to them. At Umedia Network, which supported our landscape study, Akrishi, Shubhashish, and others, a big thanks to them, and we'll continue to collaborate with them in the future. And then finally, of course, to the AI team led by Urvashi, but Angelina and Harsh, Joanne, Amrita, and others. So yeah, quick thanks to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the panelists, and look forward to interacting with you in the future. And I will just finally introduce myself. I'm Vikram, and I'm the co-director of Tandem Research. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.